Good afternoon. Welcome to you all, and welcome to this lunchtime seminar organized by the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. My name's David Feldman. I'm the director of the Birkbeck Institute. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Doug Rossinow, who is professor of history at Metro State University at St. Paul in Minnesota in the United States. Among his recent books are The Reagan Era, A History of the 1980s, published by Columbia University Press, and two books of essays, one on the religious left in American history, published by Palgrave, and another Outside In, the Transnational Circuitry of US History, published by Oxford University Press. He's currently working on a book titled Promised Land, The World of American Zionism, 1942 to 2025. And today he's going to speak for roughly half an hour, and then we'll open things up for questions and discussion. And his paper, which obviously, as I think will be clear, is derived from his work on his forthcoming book. His paper is entitled Aliya and Antisemitism, US Zionism in the World, 1948 to the present. And we look forward to it very much, Doug.
Thank you, David, and everybody at BISA for their support and assistance. It's great to be here. And why don't I just get started? I'm going to try to share my screen and see if I can get the slideshow begun. And can people see my slide? No?
It's not on slideshow yet, Doug.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, I can see the slide.
How about now?
Yeah. I can see. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, now, okay, great. Sorry about the technical complexities, largely beyond my capacities. But I do want to talk today about Aliya and anti-Semitism, US Zionism in the world, 1948 to the present. Here you see the image, a large image of a lapel pin with the US and Israeli flags sported by a great many US politicians of both political parties, of course, representing the strong bilateral relationship between the two states. I want to talk a little bit today about the US Zionist movement, and I mean the Jewish Zionist movement. The Christian Zionism is a separate phenomenon in American history. I'm talking about Jewish Zionism, Zionism in the American Jewish community, and I want to emphasize it as part of a world Zionist movement. I want to think a little bit about the dynamics of the transnational Zionist movement, but also about matters internal to the experience of Jews in the United States who were strong supporters of Israel and identify themselves as Zionists after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The question of Aliya, which I'm foregrounding here, was highly controversial in the World Zionist movement after 1948, and the controversy centered very clearly, emphatically, on the Americans, Zionists from the United States, who in the eyes of their Israeli comrades had failed in their Zionist obligation to move to the new Jewish state after it was established. The concept of Aliya, traditionally a religious concept in Judaism, the act of ascending to a raised dais in a synagogue sanctuary to read from the Holy Torah scrolls. Zionists use this term, the Hebrew term, meaning literally to go up, to refer to any Jew who emigrated into Israel. A Gentile who moved to Israel wasn't doing Aliyah, was not making Aliyah, but a Jew who moved to Israel was. And there was what one prominent American Zionist in the post-1948 years called an avalanche of vilification directed at the American Zionists for not making Aliya. There was an extensive debate about this, really quite a vituperative debate in the Zionist Congress held in Jerusalem in 1951. And David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister and preeminent political leader in Israel during its early years, voiced this criticism of the Americans frequently, as did many other Israelis. At one point, Ben-Gurion said that Americans, in his words, were not sufficiently American and therefore not sufficiently Zionist. America was built by pioneers. And he was saying that Americans, in conquering the North American continent, had shown what he called the pioneer spirit, and this was the spirit needed for new settlers in the state of Israel, and that American Jews were betraying not only their Zionist obligations, but their American heritage. And he, of course, was making a rather explicit comparison between frontier experiences of white Americans in the United States and Jews in the state of Israel and the land of Israel, which critics today would see as evidence for a shared history of settler colonialism. These were the words that Ben-Gurion used. If you wish to understand why American Jews and specifically active Zionists did not ever seriously entertain, with the exception of a small number of individuals, they did not seriously entertain moving to the state of Israel. I think you have to understand the general environment for American Jews in the United States in the decades after 1945. The era from 1945 to 1975 was an era of great and rising American Jewish self-confidence, communal confidence, strong belief that was grounded in reality, I think, that the situation and the position of American Jews was rising, was getting better, and was probably going to continue to get better socially, economically, culturally, and politically. Of course, there was a history of anti-Semitism in America, and in some ways, anti-Semitic or Judeophobic attitudes had actually gotten worse in the United States during the World War II years. But it's quite a remarkable phenomenon. Immediately after 1945, all measurable indices of anti-Semitic attitudes declined precipitously, steeply in the United States. The social prescriptions and limitations that had been imposed on American Jews in the preceding decades started to crumble, and they did gradually but quickly in the succeeding decades. And there's much to say about why this happened, but I just wanted to establish that all histories of American Jewish life and history specifically of anti-Semitism in the United States agree on this point, that the immediate post-war decline in anti-Semitism in the United States was very dramatic. I think in this context, one has to understand the Zionism of American Jews as an expression of communal self-confidence and not as a reflection of fears for the future. And this was, in a sense, the latter, was the classic Zionist theme expressed by Theodor Herzl and many others, including some of the Israelis after 1948 who criticized the Americans, that Zionism was necessary because anti-Semitism was pervasive, ineradicable, and Jews everywhere needed an escape from the danger of anti-Semitism. American Jews who were strong Zionists completely rejected that view. Rose Halprin, who was the leader of Hadassah after 1948, the Women's Zionist Organization of America and the largest Zionist organization in the United States, said that we will not have our children, she said them, she meant our children, we will not have them told it will happen here, that is in the United States. Some of the Israelis had said, look, you as American Jews feel secure in the United States, but so did the German Jews before Hitler and the Nazis. And Halprin, along with the other Zionists in the United States, completely rejected that kind of talk. I want to focus a little bit specifically here on an argument that some opponents of Zionism in the United States made. Sometimes it was made by Jews. There were a dwindling number of actively anti-Zionist American Jews at this time. They formed an organization in the 1940s called the American Council for Judaism. The argument was also made by opponents of Zionism among Gentile or critics of Zionism, I should say. These included sometimes US State Department officials. The American Council for Judaism, others sometimes made the argument recurrently to American Zionists that their very militancy would produce anti-Semitism, would excite an anti-Semitic backlash against perceptions of an untoward Jewish power influencing US foreign policy, and that therefore the Zionists should tone down their rhetoric and their overt efforts to influence US policy toward the Middle East. I think that you have to understand that this argument was made recurrently and that it never worked, in the sense that it never convinced US Zionists at all. They were utterly unmoved by this argument. And again, this reflects their own growing self-confidence as a community in the United States. And there's some evidence. There was one study in the late 1940s comparing attitudes of American Jews who were active Zionists and those who were not. And it appeared that the Zionists were less fearful of anti-Semitism than was the Jewish community in the United States generally, which is very intriguing finding, and again runs contrary to some classic themes or ideas about anti-Semitism. I want to jump ahead now. Time is limited to the post-1967 era, I should say. The 1967 war transformed the Middle East, and it transformed the position of Zionism in the United States and even more in the world. There were muted effects of the kind I'm going to describe in the United States, but more dramatically in the world, in the global South, first and foremost, but also, I think, gradually in Europe. The position of Israel seemed different, I think, in the world as a whole after 1967. Israel conquered vast new territories, as you can see in the map on the right on screen. Before 1967, I think world perceptions of the Arab-Israeli conflict basically saw Israel in conflict primarily with neighboring Arab states. Those states, in many ways, were not particularly attractive players or actors on the world stage, although Nasser's regime in Egypt certainly had a following, particularly in the global South. Definitely in Europe and the United States, this face-off between Israel and, on the other hand, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq as well, even though Iraq did not share a border with Israel. That way of seeing who the players were in the Middle East conflict made it pretty easy for people, especially in the global North, to sympathize with Israel, which was a democracy and existed until 1967 within boundaries established in armistice agreements that had been negotiated and blessed by the United Nations in 1949. After 1967, I think there was a dramatic change, not just in the map of the Middle East, but also in the perception of who Israel was in conflict with most directly. I think after this time, the Palestinians appeared much more prominently in international perceptions as a primary player in this drama or this conflict. Israel was directly ruling over and dominating more than 1.5 million Palestinians in land it now occupied on the West Bank, as well as in Gaza and East Jerusalem. So it was, I think, almost guaranteed that world opinion as a whole would become less sympathetic to Israel now that their conflict appeared to be first and foremost with a dispossessed, stateless people whom they were directly ruling, dominating in, under conditions that obviously were not democratic in the occupied Palestinian territories. This change in opinion happened, as I said, first in the global South, as symbolized by the invitation of Yasser Arafat, head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, to address the UN General Assembly in 1974 and in other more other actions by the United Nations that were, more critical and more hostile to Israel. But I think gradually attitudes among Gentiles in Europe and even in the United States began to become far more critical of Israel. And this was the basic reason for the change in world opinion. It was the 1967 conquest and the occupation and rule over the Palestinians by Israel in the occupied territories. And I think initially after 1967, among American Jews who were increasingly enthusiastic about Israel, there was a period of euphoria over these conquests, over the dramatic demonstration of Israel's military prowess and its triumph over the states who'd been its enemies. But after several years, I think some American Zionists realized that they needed to cope with the increasingly challenging climate of world opinion. And the major discursive and political response, I think, to this new environment was the idea that there was a new anti-Semitism afoot in the world, and a notion that was first expressed dramatically and explicitly in the United States by American Zionists immediately following the 1973 war. So there was sort of a 6-year delay, further developments, another war. But I still think fundamentally this idea of a new anti-Semitism, which appeared in the title of a book published in 1974, authored by people who were very involved with the Anti-Defamation League in the United States. It was called the New Anti-Semitism. Expressed this view that the problem was not that Israel had conquered territories and was continuing to occupy them. The problem was that there was a new anti-Semitism. And for a long time, the concept of anti-Semitism in the United States had been dominated by the liberal idea, in the American sense, a kind of center-left idea that anti-Semitism was fundamentally a kind of illiberal virus of hatred that threatened not only the Jews, but other minority groups and liberal society as such. And this now started to compete with a new conception, a different conception, a definition of anti-Semitism that I would associate with the neoconservative movement in the 1970s and 1980s. The idea that anti-Semitism should be conceived of not as a kind of illiberal attitude, but as a hostility to Jewish interests and to Jewish power in the United States, but also in the world as a whole. And nowhere was Jewish power more clearly on display than in the state of Israel. So the neoconservatives who made the argument that there was a new anti-Semitism located hostility to the state of Israel at the center of anti-Semitism, which is why they called it a new form of anti-Semitism. And this had never been especially important in Jewish or Gentile discussions of anti-Semitism before 1967. There have been many iterations of this concept of a new anti-Semitism since then, but what I want to do here is focus on when the idea first appeared, which I think is very important in understanding its character. I'm going to jump ahead again. As I said, there were many iterations of the concept of this new anti-Semitism, which primarily took the form of hostility to the state of Israel and also to other forms of Jewish power and other Jewish interests. This idea got a new lease on life or more new energy into it after 9/11, the 9/11 attacks in 2001. The idea of a new anti-Semitism that was centered on hostility to Israel became the subject of many more publications after 9/11, some of them directed at Jewish audiences, some of them very clearly directed at Christian audiences. And so I want to just briefly touch on some elements or points in this discourse on a new anti-Semitism in the United States, particularly among Zionists in the 20 some odd years between 9/11 and today. One important change is that in the period before 9/11, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, those who spoke of a new anti-Semitism identified Palestinian nationalism as a primary threat to Israel and Jewish interests, and they identified it with a kind of secular leftist terrorism embodied in various groups, the Black September Organization and others. After 9/11, that idea of a kind of left-wing global terrorist network vanished and was replaced with the idea of a global Islamist network in which, Muslim hostility to Israel was embedded. And that continues to be the way the primary threat to Israel is in a global context is framed in many of these writings today. Second, there was an old idea that, again, got a new lease on life. The idea that anti-Semitism basically is anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And, this argument rages in all manner of contexts today. I think people have become familiar with those arguments once again in the year since the October 7th attacks against Israel, and then the beginning of Israel's war on Gaza. The idea, I don't need to go into detail about this, I think, with everyone, arguments about whether there's a difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Another concept, a theme that's been very prominent, I think, is what I would call safetyism. There's a pervasive rhetoric of safety and threats to persons and groups' safety in American culture, particularly in liberal culture, but it's spread to conservative culture, I think, to some extent. The idea that various groups who historically have been oppressed and abused can be threatened both physically but also psychologically by expressions of hostility, and that people of good faith should try to protect members of those groups from those feelings of endangerment as well as from physical endangerment. The old classic Zionist answer again would have been Aliya, would have been that Jews need to move to Israel because they'll be safe there. But after October 7th, that argument has been difficult to make. So once again, for American Zionists, Aliya, while something is seen as something to be honored for those who wish to engage in it, American Zionists don't view it as any kind of a comprehensive or generally attractive option for Americans, even if they don't have the same confidence about the future as a community that American Jews did between 1945 and 1975. And last, I'll just touch on the idea that Zionism excites or produces anti-Semitism. I mentioned earlier that this argument was often made by anti-Zionists, and it was put to American Zionists in the decades after 1948, and it didn't make any sense to these Zionists. They didn't believe it. They brushed it aside as a lame effort to deter them from their activism. But, there may be a question today about whether it seems more plausible than in the past that Zionism excites anti-Semitism. Now, many people, and you see the picture in the sort of to the left and lower down here of Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the head of the ADL today and has been probably the most prominent voice in the United States among American Jews and American Zionists, arguing that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism or that anti-Zionism is motivated by anti-Semitism. But I think beneath the surface, there's actually a real debate among those who do see anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as hopelessly entangled today about whether anti-Semitism has prompted anti-Zionism, or about whether Zionism, in some of its contemporary forms, particularly as practiced in the state of Israel and supported by some Jews in the United States and elsewhere, whether that actually helps to produce anti-Semitism, given that American Jews for decades have sought to identify themselves as a community with the cause of Zionism and the state of Israel. Is there a hope of separating these things any longer, and if not, why not? So that's a closing thought, and I'm going to end the show and stop the share. So that's what I wanted to say. I just wanted to put a few ideas out there, and I'd be very happy to hear people's questions and comments. I'll try to answer questions that people might have.
Thank you very much, Doug. If, as I hope people do, you do have questions you'd like to put or points you'd like to make, please do raise your virtual hand, and I'll call on you to articulate your point or put your question. Let me go first, though, Doug. And I can see you gave an account of why the new the idea of the concept of the new anti-Semitism was in the interests of American Jewish Zionists after 1967 and after 9/11. But if we're dealing with something which is partly a matter of interest, but also partly a question of the history of ideas, I wonder whether we also need to ask why was this concept a persuasive? Why were people convinced by it? And I want to just put out a couple of perhaps contributory factors and see what you think of them. One is, and this is based on some work I've been doing recently on the 1960s, and actually found articles by Foster, who wrote the New Anti-Semitism book, actually articles from him from the late 60s saying there is a problem. He might not have used the phrase new anti-Semitism, but he was pushing in that direction in the 60s. But his target was Black-Jewish relations in the United States. And so one question I have is, to what extent was the vision of the world being articulated through the new anti-Semitism actually being lived by growing numbers of Jewish people in the United States in class relations and in their relations with Black people in the city, that they were increasingly found themselves in an antagonistic relationship, and sometimes in a relationship of a political or economic power. The other reason why the new anti-Semitism idea was persuasive was because sometimes, not necessarily inherently, but sometimes a criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism after 1967 actually was anti-Semitic when understood in the good old-fashioned way.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for the questions, David. And I think you've touched on something very important. But I want to start by recalling the way you began the question, which was to think about asking if we should think about why this idea was persuasive of a new anti-Semitism. And the first thing to say is, I didn't say it was persuasive. I didn't say it had been persuasive. And I think there's actually a question about how far it did persuade American Jews, right? Because I think that there was a split in the 1970s and 1980s when this idea became more explicit and prominent of a new anti-Semitism. Basically, the neoconservatives embraced this idea fully, and it was conjoined very much to their critique of race relations and militant anti-racist Black activism. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. But there were many other American Jews, including many Zionists, who basically didn't buy this neoconservative package of ideas. So I'm not sure exactly how to measure this quantitatively, but I'm not sure that it commanded this the concept of the new anti-Semitism. I'm not sure whether, at least in its full-fledged form, it persuaded a majority of American Jews. Even in its full-fledged neoconservative form, it wasn't completely present probably until the 1980s. What you see starting in the late 1960s all the way up through 1980 and Ronald Reagan's election as US president is a gradual unveiling of this concept of a new anti-Semitism, with Israel moving closer and closer to the center, becoming increasingly dominant in the concept. In the late 60s, the first intimations of what you might call growing anti-Semitism among some Jewish groups, such as the ADL, well, particularly the ADL, you can see the balance between concerns about what they see as Black anti-Semitism and concerns about hostility to Israel, the balance between these elements shifting. And at first, their fears of Black anti-Semitism are more prominent, and more broadly, anti-Semitism among a youthful left, in which they see African-American militants playing a leading role. And gradually, with time, that it doesn't become unimportant, but it fades in relative importance, and the importance of anti-Israel hostility becomes stronger and stronger. But the two things are tied. As far as the global left is concerned, the new left, as it is represented and experienced in the United States, the vanguard of anti-Israel and pro-Palestine sentiment is in the Black movement. There's no question. So that by the early 70s, I think in Black radicalism in the United States, pro-Palestine sentiment is actually a central element. The white left, not quite as much, but it's becoming more important. And there were times when that hostility to Israel was expressed in a kind of crude anti-Semitic form, with Israel's alleged theft of lands from the Arabs likened to the commercial exploitation of Black communities by Jewish merchants, in the inner cities. How American Jews experience this rising tension with the African-American community, complicated question, because the rising tension and conflict was occurring at a time when social contact between Blacks and Jews was becoming much less frequent. So that experience of the hostility was increasingly being reified through various cultural and political representations at some remove. So that's only a brief answer to a big question.
Thank you, Doug. We have a couple of people waiting. Richard Cufton, do you want to ask your question or make your point?
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, Doug, for an excellent presentation. 2 points, please. I don't quite understand. Maybe I've got it wrong, but you're saying that it was the illiberal virus of hatred was now competing with the neoconservative movement. Were you saying that the neoconservative movement was exhibiting anti-Semitism, or was it against the illiberal anti-Semitism that we'd seen before? That's my first point. The second point is, I think we all know that there's probably a very thin line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in terms of some of the traditional anti-Semitic tropes that are being exhibited by anti-Zionists. What are those tropes, and where do you actually draw the line between the two?
Yeah, well, it's easier to answer your first question. Do you want, David, do you want me to wait for a second person to speak?
No, I think you go ahead now, and then we'll
Okay,
take Brian's
okay.
question afterwards.
Yeah, the first question is easy to answer. No, I wasn't trying to say that the neoconservatives were expressing anti-Semitism. So I'm sorry if that was unclear, but I think that there were two competing concepts, understandings of what anti-Semitism is and was, very clearly competing and contrasting concepts. So and one was starting to displace or at least compete with the other. I think it was starting to displace the other. The second, where do you draw the line? I think everybody has their own line. So everybody sort of, I mean, my experience is that every individual sort of customizes their own line. I think it's, a highly contested thesis that anti-Semitism today generally exhibits anti-Semitism and uses anti-Semitic tropes, although, one has to say that is possible and that sometimes that might occur or does occur. But, the conversation in the UK may be somewhat different or in a somewhat different place than in the United States. I'm not sure. Maybe it's less different than it was a year and a half ago, but there's a lot of overheated rhetoric. And I do think that a lot of American Jews who support the state of Israel reflexively have felt threatened by the rhetoric of anti-Zionism, which has become stronger in the United States in the last year, that basically rhetorically talks about basically undoing 1948, turning back the clock to 1947. And that kind of talk itself, I think, is an expression of great anger and disillusionment over the prospects of any kind of a two-state solution, even if that's not consciously the mindset of the people who are speaking. I think that's, as an historian, I think that's where it comes from, the frustration, the 30-year-old frustration of that idea. So we could talk all day about this, but that's just a brief answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Brian Chayet, do you want to?
Yes, yes. I don't think I can get my camera to work, Doug. I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just want to go back to the early part of your talk, and I found your talk really interesting, and it's a great project. And to do with Aliya. So in the UK, David Cesarani argued in his PhD and early articles on British Zionism that it was a form of diaspora nationalism. In fact, it was a form of acculturation and had very little to do with Aliya. And it would seem to me that that argument could be applied and should be applied to the US. So it kind of answers the quandary about how you can be an American Zionist and not go to Israel. It was a minority pursuit both in the US and the UK to actually make Aliya, to immigrate to Israel. That Zionism was a form of acculturation. So diaspora nationalism was a way of associating yourself with other minority groups. And I think the same applies to the question of the new anti-Semitism, or if you like, the claim of victimhood in the US. So the claim of victimhood is quite a useful claim after 1967 and after the 1980s, etc. So so the question is Zionism actually, and the claim of the new anti-Semitism, a form of acculturation?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, with regard to the earlier history of Zionism in the United States, I think that's a familiar idea because it was expressed so explicitly by Louis Brandeis early in the 20th century that you became a better Zionist, you were a better American, and the analogy with other forms of diaspora nationalism on the part of other ethnic groups as those were defined in the United States was often cited. I tend not to think that this was the motivation. I don't mean this is what you're saying, But I tend to think that American Jews who became Zionists, at least in large numbers, especially in the 1940s, and I'm particularly focused on that period, the 1940s onward, they had a very clear argument about why they supported creating a Jewish state in Palestine. And I see little reason to doubt the sincerity of what they were saying, and that this was actually their motivation, which was they thought that a haven, a refuge was needed for the Jews of Europe, those who survived the Holocaust, after 1945, and for any Jews who might be live in conditions of danger and oppression in the future. But they felt that just did not include them. That did not include Jews in the United States. It was for other Jews elsewhere that a Jewish state was needed. And it was fairly cut and dried what the argument was. Although there were some in the core of the Zionist movement who had a more elaborate ideological argument to make. As to whether the new anti-Semitism is a form of acculturation because it basically includes Jews in a sort of pervasive pattern of kind of a discourse or culture of victimhood. I think there's been I think that's in a sense true. I think there may have been a little bit of cynicism in recent months and years about activists using, Jewish activists in the United States on university campuses and elsewhere, using the rhetoric and the tools that I would associate with safetyism to advance their own cause and to try to silence, highly critical voices highly critical of Israel. And I frankly, I think that was, a lot of people saw that coming, right? Because, the logic of safetyism, particularly on college and university campuses, is that a group that has experienced oppression gets to define what the contemporary forms of that oppression are and which should be proscribed. And if that applies to other groups, then why not to Jews? And so I think we're seeing the consequences of that right now.
Thank you, Doug. Eva Turner, I've seen your question. We have a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll paraphrase for Doug, and then I'll come to you, Eva, after Doug has answered them. So Diana Kornbrot has been writing in the chat. Basically, what Diana wants to points to is the divided nature of the American Jewish population. It does not present a monolithic stance. She highlights a Pew survey in 2024 that reveals 40% of American Jews have a favorable view of the Palestinian people. And she says, how can anything be seen while ignoring this 40% of the American Jewish population? And there's a comment from Doug in London, who asks whether there is any difference in reaction to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism between different movements of United States Judaism.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you for these comments and questions. They're very important. Of course, there's a difference between, at least in theory, there's a difference between the American Jewish community and American Zionism. Although what I think happened in the period basically between 1948 and pretty recently, over a half-century period, there was gradually a conflation of Jewishness and Zionism in the United States. I often tell people, I grew up, a Jewish kid in the New York area in the 1970s and 1980s, and I would say I grew up in a thoroughly Zionist environment, but no one ever used that word. No one ever used the term Zionism, and that's because there was no need for it. If everyone is a Zionist, then there's no need to cite that kind of explicit ideological identification. It had become a kind of common sense that that supporting the state of Israel as a Jewish state was an aspect or an extension of being Jewish. So I think that conflation was powerful and real, and it advanced in stages in the half century after 1948. I think in recent years, there's been some separation. And the most explicit and most dramatic manifestation of this is just in the last 10 to 15 years, really in the last 10 years, the reemergence of an explicit Jewish anti-Zionism certainly among a small percentage of American Jews. That's different from sympathizing with the Palestinians. These are people who call themselves and take on the political identity of anti-Zionists. But that had been absent, virtually absent, within American Jewish life for decades. And the fact that this could appear at all, I think, is evidence that there were deeper forces of alienation and broader forces present, for some time, building for some time. And there is a large percentage of the American Jewish community, if you want to talk about that, who are estranged from the state of Israel, don't identify with it particularly, and are at least sympathetic to the Palestinians, regardless of what their specific political position is on the Israel-Palestine conflict. The thing is, there's a big difference between American Jews as a whole and American Jews who are active in Jewish organizations, whether you're talking about active as members of synagogues or in groups, whether it's the ADL, B'nai B'rith, anything else, even like J Street or Jewish Voice for Peace. I mean, there are vast numbers of American Jews who are not active in any kind of Jewish organization. And the sort of active Jews, and most of all, people you might call the professional Jews who devote their careers to working in Jewish organizations, in the entire period since 1948 have been very strongly pro-Israel and became, quite strongly Zionist pretty fast. And that has continued to be the case pervasively, such that there is at least a very large minority of American Jews in the United States who really can't find a place to express their views on Israel and Palestine in an explicitly Jewish organizational or communal setting, because those settings tend to be controlled by people who are very strongly Zionist and strongly defend the state of Israel and most or all of its actions.
Thank you, Doug. Did you want to say something about the different strands in American Judaism?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. There are three major religious strands in American Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism. This tripartite division might not be as familiar in Great Britain as it is in the United States. Of the three branches, Conservative Judaism, which really started in the late 19th century, was Zionist from the start and has been the most thoroughly and consistently Zionist of the three branches. And the fortunes of the different branches of organized Judaism in the United States have gone up and down. The Reform Jews, that Reform Judaism started in Germany in the 19th century, and it moved to the United States with the German migration to the United States, which included a lot of Jews. Reform Judaism was quite explicitly anti-Zionist in the late 19th century, and that lasted until the 1930s, really, when it started to change. And so Reform Jews have, those who know that organizational or religious history, after they've basically gone on board with the Zionist program and supporting the state of Israel, felt like they had to make up for lost time and maybe, in a sense, compensate for their denomination, if you wish to call it that, their denomination's earlier history of anti-Zionism. Sometimes the Reform Zionists acted more Zionist than thou. Orthodox Jews have become more Zionist in recent years, particularly as the modern Orthodox community has grown, and they've become more and more prominent in Zionist affairs in groups like AIPAC and in others.
Thank you very much, Doug. I think that we don't have any further questions in the room or in the chat. So, Eva, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Do you have any feel for how tribal the feelings among the two Jewish groups are right now after, or emotional after the 7th of October? How do people actually cope now?
Well, if I can ask you, the two groups you're referring to.
Well, the pro-Palestinian movement among Jews and the pro-Zionist movement.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer is. Of course, people who are politically active in organized groups will feel a sense of community and cohesion. So anti-Zionists who are involved in Jewish Voice for Peace, which is the leading American Jewish anti-Zionist group now, I think they will feel a sense of strong cohesion, but only some are involved in that kind of activism. People who are strongly pro-Israel and Zionist still today, after everything that's happened in the last year, and who are vocal about it, they tend to invoke the importance of the community or the tribe, if you wish to call it that, and they'll use expressions like Kalal Yisrael, or even just the family, the Jewish family. Sometimes the argument has been made in the past that if Jews have criticisms to make of the state of Israel, they should, quote unquote, keep it in the family, right? That's a traditional phrase. So how strongly people really experience that sense of a cohesive community that is Zionist will depend on how deeply involved they are, I think, in Jewish organizations. If somebody is an active member of a synagogue has strong connections to Israel, they'll feel that strongly, right? Others might have a more tenuous connection.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Eva. We have time for one more question, if anyone would like to pose it. If not, then I'd like to thank everyone for coming along at this lunchtime, for persevering through our technical hiccup. Above all, I'd like to thank Doug Rossinow for treating a complex subject with such clarity and insight. And thank you very much indeed, Doug.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.